Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Pond Hunter broadcast from the Under the Sea radio show on Blog Talk Radio. The Pond Hunter, in the pursuit of all things aquatic. Take a look into the world of koi ponds, water gardens, and the lifestyles of the aquatically obsessed. Meet the pros, hobbyists, and cover some no-nonsense pond advice straight from the field. The Pond Hunter, in the pursuit of all things aquatic. Here's your host, koi pond and water garden expert, Mike Gannon.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Pond Hunter radio broadcast. Thank you for making it tonight to the show. I'm very happy to be here with all of you tonight. So welcome to episode 19 of the Pond Hunter radio broadcast. I'm Mike Gannon, I'm your host. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Kelly Billing. Kelly is a water garden and aquatic plant expert, and she's going to be here with us. Kelly, are you on the line?
I am here.
Hey, Kelly, how you doing?
I'm well, and you?
I'm doing just fine. I'm a big fan of the lotus plant in general. I just love it. I love that it's kind of mystical and spiritual, and it has a lot of cultural significance. And you even see that in artwork. There's a lot of art that's been generated by the lotus, paintings, drawings, even tattoos. So when I came across your book, The Lotus, Know It and Grow It, I got it from Amazon, and both of Kelly's books can be found on Amazon.com. And I read that. It's a really nice book. It has lots of great pictures, illustrations. It's laid out very nicely, and it's really an enjoyable read. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up getting involved with that, the writing of that.
Oh, let's see. I have been, I guess, pretty prolific writer since the beginning, and I worked way back when with Pond Keeper magazine, and Paula Biles, who is my co-author on the Lotus book, was also my editor when used to write for Pond Keeper magazine, and she and I work extremely well together. She's a librarian, and she keeps a tight ship, and I'm sort of the loose, free-spirited, creative partner. So we write really well together. The International Water Gardening Society was looking for something to offer its members, and they asked us to voluntarily write a book about lotus. Okay. And that was given to every member of the society at that time. It was a huge undertaking, and we couldn't fit, I guess we discarded about half of what we wrote because we had limitations as to how many pages we could put, how many, because it had to do with postage requirements and budgetary things that had to be met. So after they did that, and we asked if we could purchase the reprint rights, which we did, and we reprinted it ourselves because we thought it was too much energy was expended to let it just fall by the wayside. So we bought that, reprinted it, and it's not a big book, but it's very informative. It's got no white space. We packed it as full as we could squeeze things in there. It's in there. And it was very enjoyable. I'm very attached to that plant. I make art with it myself. Paula Biles went to Thailand 5 or 6 years ago, and she brought me back a lotus box that was wrapped in a leaf and painted in beautiful red and gold and metallic paint. And I called some friends in Thailand insistent on, how do you do that? This is beautiful. And they all told me it was a Thai trade secret. So I have spent the last few years figuring out how I can paint lotus leaves and wrap boxes and canvases and stone and other things with lotus leaves. And you can find that on I have I have 5 Facebook pages, but that one would be Facebook Nalumbo 2218, I think.
Okay.
But if you Facebook my page, then you can link it from there.
Okay. Yeah, it's a great book. It has chapters on its botanical background, its cultivation and landscape uses, a chapter on 101 other uses for the plant, which is pretty amazing. I mean, just the versatility of that plant and how it is used, and even within cultural traditions. And I guess I was looking at the timeline. It goes back 34 million years. So it's been with us for quite some time now. It's been with us longer than we've been.
Yeah, and I believe Paula there's new information that dates it back, I think, 133 million years, if I'm correct.
Wow.
Back as they timeline things.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I'm sure it'll be with us.
It's one of the most researched plants in the world. It has remarkable history. I grew it in my backyard before I even had a pond. We grew it in a 36-inch container that I buried in my perennial garden, and within 2 weeks there were 14 different, I guess you could say, bits of wildlife had been attracted to this little 3-foot hole in the ground.
Wow.
Water boatmen, water skates, beetles, butterflies, toads, frogs, the cat who chased the frogs. But point being is that it attracts an abundance of wildlife like no other plant that I know. And it has remarkable history. There's just medicine, food, NASA, spacesuits, windshields, surgical scrubs, all have some components of lotus research as a part of them now.
And there's a lot of kind of funny pictures in the book of people wearing lotus leaves as hats and,
When my daughter was young, we didn't dare have a paper party hat. We always had lotus leaf hats. There was a room full of little girl fairies. So
that's
I
so
also
funny.
got to learn it from the perspective of my children's eyes, and I think that's a lot of its charm as well.
I was called out, I guess it was 2 years ago. I went to, in central Jersey, there was a corporate center that had basically a drying out pond. So it was very marshy, but it had gotten overgrown with lotus. Somebody had introduced lotus, and I'd seen lotus many, many times. But going down there, I'd never seen before that the lotus leaves were coming up 6 feet, 7 feet above the ground. I mean, they were tremendous. And then I saw a picture in your book of a guy standing on the side of a road, which appears to be with a lotus leaf that's probably like 9 feet tall. That's amazing. Is that an actual lotus leaf that tall, or was that?
It is an actual lotus leaf with an unadulterated stem. I've actually seen it with 15-foot stems when it's trying to reach across a body of water, if that's a large pond or a river. It will actually make itself a suspension bridge where the leaves hold the rootstock underneath parallel to the surface of the water, and it will reach out, 30, 40, 60, 80 feet into a body of water in search of the other side. And when that happens, the leaf stems get even longer.
Wow, that is the will to survive.
Yes.
No doubt.
The will to the other side.
There's a lot of lore, because it's been around so long, that goes along with lotus. And it varies from culture to culture. What's the most interesting bit of lotus lore that you have heard?
Oh, gosh. I mean, there's so much history associated with it. That's a tough one. I guess the biggest thing is about, Auburn University had a project, I think it ran for 10 years, called the Lotus Project. And a gentleman from their was getting his PhD, and he was from China. And he did a huge amount of lotus research. And one of the things that he left Auburn with is the task, he's back in China, the task to DNA map lotus worldwide, and trying to map its progression continentally around the world, and how much variation and change, how in Egypt the seeds are 2,500 years old and still germinate today. You know, what is the oldest seed to germinate? Is it 2,500, 3,500, 5,000 years old? Until the outside of the seed coating is scarified, nothing happens to it. It remains perpetually the same. It is a plant that is so thick with history and stories and spirituality, medicine. It's just really hard to answer that.
Well, have you eaten lotus?
All the time.
Oh, yeah?
We go on a river in Maryland. When Dyka came here, I took him for DNA sampling on the Sassafras River on Maryland's eastern shore. It's only known in 3 places in the state of Maryland anymore. One of it was reestablished by, in more recent years. The other 2 are naturally occurring. A lot of natural stands of lotus have been killed due to pollution. And we go down there to give you an analogy of how tasty lotus is. My son, who was raised in the nursery, is a lotus seed fanatic. And the first time we went to the river to see lotus growing in its natural environment, he was about 7, 8 years old, and we couldn't find him for 2.5 hours. And so he finally resurfaced perfectly at home on the water in his kayak, and I asked him where he'd been, and he said he was busy. I said, busy? What were you busy doing? He was busy eating lotus seeds for 2.5 hours.
Oh, my God.
They're really good. They really, really are. The young seeds have a taste, a cross between sweet corn and a sweet pea. And as they mature, they have the flavor of a chestnut.
Oh, wow.
So everywhere in between.
Yeah. And there's many ways to prepare it.
Yep. The roots sent some into my daughter's preschool, and she made some with cinnamon, some with allspice, powdered sugar, granulated sugar, and some plain, and the kids wouldn't eat any of them except the plain ones. They said the other ones tasted bad, so it naturally has a good flavor.
Yeah.
Although
That's
different varieties do taste different.
Yeah. It's very cool, and it's a great book, The Lotus, Know It and Grow It. Now, I didn't get a chance to read the Water Gardener's Bible yet. Tell me a little bit about it.
That's a cooperative effort I did with Ben Helm, who is an amazing man, a wealth of knowledge. He has done a lot of research. He's very well versed. He is in England. He's not here. So he wrote that book, and I contracted with him. He wanted me to write the plant sections. So I did that. He wrote the rest. So it was a cooperative effort again. And it has a lot of information that I haven't found in other books. Ben is very articulate, very knowledgeable, and he put together probably one of the best rounded books if you're, an established water gardener, to give you some additional information that you can, and beginner too, probably. It's a great book. I just wrote the plant sections, and it was published in the UK and here under 2 different names. Also, the Lotus book was published, translated and published in Korean as well.
Oh, wow, that's cool. Are these books available as e-books, or are they just the physical hard and soft cover books?
just as hard and soft-cover books. Now, the Lotus book, we are out of them. We have only a little bit left, and Paula and I have a dream to redo it as an ebook so that we can put back in all of the information that we weren't able to put in, the smaller format because of budget requirements. So we have a lot of it written. We have to put it together, and both of our lives have become, I guess, too complicated for that at the moment. But we will get there. We have a website also, aboutthelotus.com, and there is a Facebook page which is About the Lotus. The Facebook page, because it's so easy, we update it twice a week, and it's new information. I think yesterday Paula put something on about some people breaking ice to harvest lotus tubers. And so there's posts at least twice a week in there about lotus. And on Fridays, she puts out what we call Spread the Joy of Lotus, and we marry a quote with a photograph, and we try to always maintain an international flair and sharing of people worldwide with lotus. Other parts of the world have a lot more knowledge and inspiration than we have here, but if you want to know more about lotus, it's a huge amount of information in there.
Yeah, I follow that page. That's a fun page. So yeah, I got it, and I need you to sign my book next time I see you.
Okay.
Let's get into water gardens a bit, and what I'd like to do is kind of walk through the planning of a water garden here for a person who's planning a water garden, and just to kind of not get, because it's such a broad subject, let's kind of look at it as if we were planning a 10 by 15 in-ground water garden. And if of course the first thing is going to be to actually construct it. So what would you say are some good parameters? I'm not talking about keeping koi and keeping fish. We're not too worried about that at this point, but just like a real straight-up water garden. What are some of the parameters as far as constructing a water garden that you would recommend? What are some
probably
good
the
depth?
The biggest thing that, if you're building to suit plant material, and I'm a firm believer that ponds are personality driven, whether they're formal or wildlife or, just average. Everybody has something that they want to get back from. There's people who build their ponds to grow food now. That's become, you talked about that earlier. That has become a really big trend again, is using your pond to grow food that you can harvest and use. Yep. But for a basic backyard pond, probably the biggest mistake that we see is that there's still a lot of information out there that tells you to, make, say, an 8 by 10, make a 1 foot wide shelf all the way around.
Right.
And I have an objection to that method. Most ponds you're going to view from a single perspective a majority of the time. That doesn't mean that you won't walk around them occasionally, but most of them are viewed, out a window, from a porch, a single point of view. And plants that get tall in the water become very buoyant. So a 1 foot wide shelf isn't adequate to hold them in an upright position. When you get past, 18 inches tall on a breezy day, things tend to want to fall in. So I like to see people build a 2 or a 3 foot wide shelf on the back side of wherever you're viewing the pond, and no shelf on the front side. That also allows your fish to come up close to you, and you can interact with them, and you're not looking in the water at a shelf or looking at your fish over some plants that are on in that foreground shelf. So just eliminate the foreground shelf and go for a wider shelf in the back so that plants can be in adequate size containers. They can have ample amounts of fertilizer, plenty of room to grow, little fishes, baby insects, worms, all dragonfly larvae, water boatmen, a lot of the other things that come along have a place to hide in those plant roots. And you know, when you have a skinny shelf all the way around, you have plants in small pots, and everything alive is accessible and becomes prey or victim to someone larger than itself. Tadpoles, fish fry. So all of those things have a more natural area, and you get a lot of the benefit of, you know, having dragonflies and you know, baby fish occasionally. You don't want too many baby fish. But
so when you're digging it out, you got to make sure you have real wide shelves and proper placement of the shelf for viewing and for optimal plant growth. When you're lining the pond, I've seen water gardens built out of everything: concrete, liner, plastic shells, vinyl, even just mud bottom. What is there a particular type of liner that you would recommend over another to build a water garden?
That one really falls into the personality thing. And you know, if your personality dictates that you want a formal water feature, then it's probably going to be concrete in most cases. Some of that depends on your budget too.
Sure.
You know, we have clients that spend, you know, we recently had one, wasn't ours, but a contractor we work with, $125,000 fish pond. So what they did is entirely different than someone whose budget might be, say, you know, $12,000.
Right.
So sometimes it's dictated by that.
Okay. So there's not really necessarily any particular liner that will benefit a water garden more than another. It's the other type of factors, budget, personality, like you said. If you're doing formal, you want concrete. If you're a natural, you know, nature-loving person, maybe you want a mud-bottom pond, you know?
Yeah,
Water.
absolutely. Or you may use liner, but you may naturalize it so that it is attractive to wildlife.
Right.
You know, having raised turtles for a very long time, aquatic turtles, I had a friend while we were on vacation bring a box turtle, but my pond wasn't built for a box turtle, so the poor box turtle died. Box turtles need to walk in and walk out. I don't have any accessibility areas like that. It drops straight off at the edge to 3.5 feet, which isn't a problem for aquatic turtles. But if you're trying to build it for all types of wildlife, you would change the way you build it, and you would change, you know, you would have soil or sand on top of your liner so that they have something that they can grip, you know, to get in and out. So it has to suit what your purpose is. Your lining would have to be appropriate to what you're trying to get to.
Okay, and that may come into play when you're considering the location as well. Now, I would think that what the photo period or how much light you're getting into your pond would be a big consideration when you're planning a water garden. What are some of the things that people consider as far as how much light they want to get into there?
That's one of the things, too. Say you're building a water feature in a shaded area as opposed to a full sun area. If it's full sun, say a hardy water lily likes it to be a little deeper because it's a little cooler and it can shade itself and it doesn't get as heat stressed if it's in, say, 2 feet deep of water. But if you're building that same pond in a shady area, you would want to create a shallower area for your water lilies because they need to believe that the day is longer than it is. So by putting them closer to the surface than you would in a full sun pond where you're trying to help them cool themselves, you're actually trying to get them up close. You would put them in, say, only 12 to 15 inches of water so that they can, they think the day is longer. You're just cheating them.
Okay.
You know, if the sunlight has to penetrate deeper, then, you know, you want maximum exposure and you want them closer to the surface, and they think the day's a little longer than it actually is.
And so the photo period will also affect flower production versus vegetated growth. Is that correct? If you have
Yes.
more light, you're likely to get flowers, where with the less light, less sunlight that you have on it, your lilies or other flower-producing plants are not going to be produce as many blooms.
Right. They won't produce as many, but if you cheat them a little bit, they think the light intensity is greater, so you will get more blooms. If you have a shady pond and you put your water lilies in 3 feet deep, you can pretty much expect never to see a flower.
Right.
So by putting them shallower, you can modify things a bit to give them a more favorable circumstance.
Now,
Even with the water lily, though, you need at least 4 hours of midday sun. So.
Okay. And to backtrack just a moment, you mentioned that the water lily basically is trying to keep itself cool. How does the temperature affect the behavior of a water lily? If it's too warm, like, can you look at a pond and say, oh, this water lily is heat stressed, or it's too cool? What are some of the things that indicates that there's a temperature problem with your pond?
That's a really good question. You know, tropical water lilies perform better in a southern climate because they like warmer water. And you can look at hardy lilies as you get further south, and they are heat stressed. It is too warm for them, just like it's not warm enough for a tropical water lily up north. So it has to do as much, it's a bit climate driven, but it's right plant, right place, which is always the case. You know, tropical lilies like it where it's warmer. So if you're trying to grow them further north, you want to create a shallow water area that's specific to that. The owner of Maryland Aquatic, in his fish pond, he has an 18-foot by 10-foot area that is just 12 inches deep. It's for all tropical water lilies. They need to be up there in the warmer water in the northern climate to really succeed. And the hardy lilies in a southern climate have to be deeper the further south that you go because it gets too hot for them. So, yes, you can see heat stress in water lilies. And cold stress, it depends. Hardy's in the south, and the same thing goes for full sun versus part shade. If they're a little bit cooler, then they're going to perform differently.
Now, when you talk about deep water and shallow water, those can be terms that can kind of be defined in a lot of different ways. So when we're talking about deep water, what would that depth be? And when we talk about shallow water, what are those depths?
For most plant shelves for shallow water, we make them 10 to 12 inches deep. And you may not use that depth, but if you say you have a 3-foot wide shelf and you want to plant something that's going to be an absolute focal point, an architectural, feature for that pond that's going to be big and bold, it's going to need a big and bold container. You can't make your shelves deeper once your pond is finished, but you can make them shallower. So to be able to accommodate something that's going to be a specimen or a focal point that's going to get really big and require a large pot, it's going to have adequate space to be able to do that. If the surrounding plants need to be a little shallower, you can always put some brick or, we use cut milk crates, bulb crates, stone to make things to act as a bit of a shelf on a shelf to get them a little shallower. And some of it is just the requirement of the plant. But as a general rule, we don't go less than 10 inches in a shallow water area. You can make it shallower, but you can't make it deeper. And deep water lilies, even hardy lilies, I think is probably the biggest flaw in my own pond. It's 3.5 feet deep. It takes them forever to wake up in the spring. The water is cold down there. So ideally it should have been 2 feet and around arm's length. It's hard to manage plants if they're in too deep of water. So koi ponds are often deeper, but not really practical for plants. So deep water is sometimes relative to what it's accommodating. 18 inches to 2 feet is fine for water lilies in the deep part. But you may want to have another deep part that's 3.5 feet for your fish. So that planning is really important in the beginning, having some idea of what you want. If it's a fish pond, if it's a water garden, if it's an architectural feature, the water depth is going to vary on all of them.
Right. So when you're planning, you kind of have to have a fair idea of what you want the finished, mature project to
right,
look like.
And it's going to have to coincide with your climate.
So
what
with that
would
in mind,
be the appropriate depths in the north may not be the appropriate depths for the same plants in the south.
Right. Yeah, so everything is relative and everything kind of changes exactly for those reasons that you're saying.
And it makes for a complicated mess.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
We'll all get through it, though. And there should be spacing considerations for certain plants, too. So, I mean, we've already talked about making the shelf wide enough, but when you're installing your plants, you don't want to crowd them too much together, because when we buy plants at a vendor, we being hobbyists, they're usually relatively young plants and small for what they potentially will be. Is that correct?
Yes, because part of that is like I talked about before, the wind and having adequate planting containers and, space for these plants, when they reach maturity, so that the wind's not blowing them over, so that they have adequate soil mass, so they have, enough fertilizer for the growing season. All of that is hinged on that. And one of the things that we always guide our customers is, to start with less, let them grow a little bit, get a feel for how much space they're going to need. I mean, we can guide them some, but overplanting seems to be heavy. But aquatic plants grow very quickly, too. Yeah. So it in the early spring, we advise against people having, putting so much in there so that by the end of the season it's overgrown, because you don't want that either.
Yeah.
And some of it has to do with their, at the pace at which they grow.
Right. And people can get very enthusiastic once they get into water gardening, and all of a sudden they want to keep everything. And I see that issue a lot in landscaping, where things get overcrowded. It's too bad. I mean, I see in a lot of landscape design these days that I call them 7-year landscape plans, because they look great for the first couple of years, but then once the plants actually grow in, they're all so spaced so closely and they get so crowded, it just looks like a jungle after 7 years. And it's time to kind of things out and start again. And I personally don't like the idea of that. I like seeing a landscape really mature over a very long period of time. Those to me have always been the more interesting landscapes, especially when I go to parks and gardens and stuff like that. The older stuff is much more interesting than the new stuff, new landscapes.
Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't have the space to grow to its potential, then it's sort of, you're depriving yourself and the plant of a really good experience by overcrowding things. I know what you're talking about, and some landscapers even plant in a 2-year plan, in which after 2 years it looks horrible.
Just a jump.
And in water gardening, because plants do grow so quickly, one of the biggest recommendations that I make is that you start with fewer varieties and get more of them. When you try to put 10, 11, 12 different varieties in a small pond, you don't get the English garden effect. It just doesn't seem to happen in the water ever. In part because it's not as much flowering material. It's more green. So you have to rely, if you look at Japanese and Asian culture, where they use form, shape, texture, and in the water garden, that's particularly important, or it ends up looking like a weedy mess very quickly. Yeah. It doesn't take 5 years. It can take one growing season. So less is more. 3 to 5 varieties, but use more of them, mass them together so that they don't compete with each other or become a tangled, mangled mess.
Yeah, go for the long-term plan. One piece of advice that I heard you giving out at Shindemonium when you were talking to the attendees there that was interesting to me is that people chronically use the wrong size containers for their aquatic plants. And a lot of that has to do with how they come to market, where you can see plants that are sold, water lilies, sold in 4-inch containers, iris in 4-inch containers, 8-inch, 10-inch. And you were pretty much saying start with a 16-inch container. Just a 16-inch
container in a water feature is the smallest container, except for very small ponds. That's the smallest pot we use. If they don't have adequate soil mass, and beside the fact that they won't stand upright because a 4-inch pot won't hold them in an upright position for more than a few minutes. 16-inch, we use 20-inch, 23-inch, 36-inch. And one of the jokes that we always make is that we have to go to a botanic garden to see what our plants look like. As a grower, you have a lot of considerations, and transportation, weight, how much you can fit. Shipping costs are extremely high when you're dealing with aquatic plants because of the weight involved. We'll have pallets, stacked loads. They'll be 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 pounds for one stacked skid. So weight is a big issue. Size is a big issue. So from a grower's perspective, to maximize the shipping costs, and the space, required for retail display as well, a smaller container is appropriate.
Right.
And it's manageable. It's handleable. If you sold all of your water lilies in your garden center at 16-inch pots, they're heavy and big, so they take up too much space. So it's not appropriate from a retail perspective. But when it goes home with you, it needs to be given, a place that is sufficient to support its growth for that growing season.
Right. So hobbyists need to keep in mind that when they're purchasing these plants, these are really temporary holding containers for retail purposes, and they should be bringing home their plants and repotting them into an appropriately sized container. What's the best potting material that people should be looking for? Because there are things on the market like aquatic plant soil that you can buy prepackaged. And then I've heard other people say, we just use screened topsoil, farm grade screened top. What do you recommend?
I'm going to address one thing first on the water lily. I've been doing this since 1986. In all of this time, the single most frequently asked question that I still get today, that I got all the way back in 1986, is why my water lily doesn't flower. And it's always because it's in too small of a pot and inadequately fed. So container size has everything to do with the health, the flowering capacity, the disease resistance, the pest resistance is going to be affected by the size container that you put it in. And when they're in pots that are too small, they're undernourished, starved, strangling, suffocating, however, which words you want to use. So larger containers are it's a requirement to the health of the whole ecosystem, I guess you could say. As for soil, we use sifted topsoil, a good grade sifted topsoil that is part clay and subsoil and part topsoil.
Okay.
Patrick Nutt at Longwood Gardens always said, if you can squeeze the soil in your hand and it will form a ball, but when you press it gently, it breaks apart, you have a good mix. If it's too dense, too rich in organic matter, too much clay, it's not going to have that ability to hold together and break apart. It can have some compost, but things that are too rich in organic matter underwater will ferment. So you don't want a lot of manure or peat moss, which would also float, but it will also ferment underwater. Too much, I don't remember what they just said, compost. You don't want too much rich material. 10 to 15% is all you would want to add to amend your soil if you think that your topsoil is too, nutrient deplete. You can cut your soil with a little bit of sand if it's too heavy on the clay side. Add a little bit of organic matter, a little bit of sand, but it makes your tools and dividing and maintaining them. The sand cuts the blade. It dulls your tools, so plant maintenance becomes more difficult when you cut it with sand. More recently, you can use cat litter, unscented, non-clumping, but even better than that is what is more often than not used as the aquatic planting soil, which is a hardened clay product called calcined clay. And calcined clay is heated to a higher temperature than cat litter. It looks like cat litter, feels like cat litter, but it's heated to a higher temperature. It's cleaner. It has dust associated with it because it's a stone product, but it doesn't, it's not like dirt, and there's no organic matter. But it's also nutrient deplete, so you have to rely more on fertilizer. But if koi get into it and stuff, it doesn't make a big mess, and you can recycle it. It's 100% recyclable. You can replant with it later. But you will have to add fertilizer more frequently.
When it comes to fertilizer, and you say more frequently, first let's talk about what type of fertilizer do you recommend, and then let's talk about the frequency of it. Because fertilizer comes in liquid, tablet. What do you think is the most effective way to fertilize a plant? Or do you use a combination of all of these?
We use a combination of two things. We don't use anything liquid because it's sort of minuscule in the grand scheme of things if you're really looking to improve plant growth. We use a granular slow-release fertilizer that was actually designed and intended for use in the rice paddies. It's actually imported from Japan. So it is intended for underwater use. Years ago, we learned a valuable lesson in using Osmocote, which is entirely temperature release. What happened was we didn't have enough fertilizer early, and when the temperatures got really warm enough for the fertilizer to release, we had too much too late and burned up a lot of things. So we use a granular release that's intended for underwater use. I think you can buy it. Well, I know that you can buy it from Aquascapes under a private label, Aquascapes brand. And then I believe it's also available retail as a product called Dynamite. And it's actually tomato fertilizer is the same one that they use for aquatic plants.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
And if you add it to a plant, say now, you're going to divide your plants in the fall, or say September. We shouldn't say now. And everything will be ready for you in spring. You can feed with that fertilizer in the fall, and it won't release until next year when the temperatures creep up. It has a different polymer coating, although it's also temperature release. It's not entirely. It's being withheld in part by moisture. But so that works really well. We add to that spring and summer tablet fertilizer. We, as employees of the nursery, are a bit lazy gardeners because we work in a nursery. We do our plant maintenance early or late in the fall and feed it up heavy so that it is nice, healthy, happy, vigorous, and then we don't fool with them again. So in a 16-inch pot, I put 7 tablets and a good handful of slow-release fertilizer, which is a lot.
Okay. And that all goes in the bottom of the container?
We put an inch or so of soil and then the fertilizer and then more soil and then the plant and the finishing of the rest of the planting. We find if the fertilizer is in contact with the plastic on the bottom of the pot, that the plant roots, that's where they go. And then you can get some burning of the roots when it's in direct contact. So if it's a little bit separated by the soil, it seems to work out better and the plants like it better. They can surround and engulf the fertilizer rather than come in direct contact with it.
Okay. So we put together a good plan for a water garden. We got the right location, the right depth, the right size. Now, what should people consider when they're choosing plants? Is there anything that they should be looking for to make sure that they're getting a high-quality plant and they're not bringing home anything that, is not going to perform for them?
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest complaints we get at the nursery is someone bought something from a box store that was in a plastic container with some dry peat moss, and it looked okay because it had some green things coming out of it, but it died. So we look for good, as standard horticultural practice would define, you want to look for something that is currently healthy and vigorous and productive, rather than something that's in a sealed container. It's aquatic, and it needs light and water to really be happy. So little plastic boxes, we try to avoid them. We'll have people come and they'll say, but I bought 4 of them, and it cost me $33, and you want me to pay $33 for one. And I said, but the difference is the $33 you spent is dead.
Yeah.
So this $33 is going to give you a beautiful water lily with lots of flowers and leaves.
It's going to live for you.
Yes, it's going to live, and it's going to be healthy and happy because it got off to a good start. Everything that you produce as a crop, if it starts out weak, it ends up weak. There are a lot of times you can salvage a plant and give it a little TLC and it'll come along and make it just fine. But that shouldn't be the norm for what you're looking for. You want to look for plants that are healthy, pest-free, disease-free, vigorous, have all signs of being, looking like they're going to be productive. It's pretty visually evident.
A beginner water gardener, what would be 3 plants that you would recommend to any beginner water gardener for ease of keeping and also to make sure that it keeps their interest and grows their interest in water gardening?
As long as they have 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, so sufficient light, absolutely a water lily. First and foremost, they're the queen of the pond. They're the gem, the main attraction, the color and the shade, and where your fish hide and play, and so a water lily would definitely be one. Iris, I would say, they're sturdy, they're tolerant, not difficult to take care of. They'll flower in the spring. I'm a strong advocate of having plants that gives you interest throughout the growing season. So I always try to pick, if I'm going to only pick 3, something that's spring, something that's summer, and maybe something that flowers later, or an early season, late season. Plants have their seasons. In part, the gentleman earlier asked about algae. If all of your plants are really in their prime, in the early spring, you're going to tend to have heavier algae blooms in the later summer because those plants that were very vigorous in the spring have slowed down and are resting by the time it comes to summer, and algae, being opportunistic, is going to jump in there. If all of your plants are summer flowering, you're going to be more prone to, heavier algae blooms in the spring. So you want to cover the seasons with your plants so that you have something actively consuming nutrients, early and late, and cover that growing season as much as possible. So there are things, one of my favorite plants, and it's one of the most difficult ones to sell because it doesn't flower until late August or early September, is Zephyranthes, the rain lily. And when everything else is just really tired and settling in for the end of summer and fall is approaching, and rain lily is just really getting geared up and started, and happy little faces just, in the middle of all of that tiredness, here comes the rain lily. So it's one of my favorites, absolutely. Of course, lotus is, but I don't know that I'd give that to the beginner. And probably pickerel. Pickerel, grows and blooms most of the summer.
Yeah,
so
it's a great plant.
It covers all your seasons, but I gave you 4 instead of 3.
That's quite all right. I think the listeners will enjoy that extra little tip, and I think we put together a good plan for anybody who's into or planning to get into water gardening. And believe it or not, the time has really kind of flown by, and I just want to thank you so much for coming on tonight, Kelly. This is awesome. I appreciate your time and sharing this great information. Really, thank you so much for coming on this evening and being a guest.
Well, I'm really glad that I could, because I think that, as the industry grows and the standard that we have is that sharing is part of the fun. It's what we like the most anyway. It's what I like the most. I want other people to get as much enjoyment out of it as we do and make it as less complicated as possible. So,
right. And I'm with you on that.
I'm glad you had me.
Well, I look forward to having you on again, and I will plan on catching up with you soon. And again, thank you so much for coming on tonight, Kelly.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Have a great evening. That was Kelly Billing, everybody, aquatic plant expert, speaker, author, and a great guest.